When the holidays start to feel a bit repetitive, reach for a Sprite Winter Spiced Cranberry and put your twist on tradition. A bold cranberry and winter spice flavor fusion, Sprite Winter Spiced Cranberry is a refreshing way to shake things up this sipping season. And only for a limited time. Sprite, obey your thirst.
Welcome to the Marvel Mindset, a podcast from ex-Marvel CEO Peter Cuneo. Listen as Peter shares inside stories of what it took to turn around Marvel. Here's your host, Peter Cuneo.
Welcome back, everyone. I'm Peter Cuneo. I'm the host of the Marvel Mindset. And today what I'd like to do is talk about the history of Marvel and then talk about what are the elements in the business that led up to Marvel's bankruptcy, which really set up Marvel, of course, for a turnaround eventually. And I think it'd be fun to start and talk a little bit about the comic book industry historically in the United States. Comic books really first came into fore in the United States during the Depression. This was a time when people were trying to escape any way they could from everyday life. By the way, the motion picture business did very well also during the Depression. But this was the spur that got people interested in looking at and starting to buy comic books. And 1938, the end of the Depression, through 1956 is often called the golden age of comic books. And this particular age was marked by the introduction of Superman in 1939. Superman #1 came out and really was a great spur to the comic book industry. By the way, if any of you who are listening and watching have an original copy in mint condition of the first issue of Superman in Action Comics, you probably can get $3 million for it today. Mint condition, however. It's interesting to me also that the 1930s were really the birth of the Walt Disney Company and the Walt Disney movies and what have you, introducing interesting characters into the entertainment workplace. Like once again, the Depression actually helped Disney just as it helped comic books. And I think it's interesting to note that Marvel now is owned by Disney all those many, almost 100 years later. During that golden age, Marvel wasn't very active, but they did introduce a very important character, Captain America, who was, of course, one of the Avengers. Captain America came out as an answer to Superman, but also as an answer to the war in Europe and the rise of the Nazis. Captain America actually had the first issue, appeared in 1941. And as time went on, the comic book business grew. But in the 1950s, there was a great uprising of parents and other people that suggested that comic books, particularly horror and crime comic books, were not a good idea for young people. And in fact, the U.S. Senate in 1954 actually held Senate hearings on comic books. And there were many people testifying who thought that comic books actually spurred juvenile delinquency and even homosexuality. And in the end, nothing came out of these Senate hearings, but the industry did get together and create the comic book code. And that really marked the end of any horror or crime-oriented books, which frankly were R-rated, in some cases a little more than R-rated, and would not be acceptable today if anyone tried to bring them back. And then we come to the silver age for comic books. This is about 1956 to 1990. And this is the time that's most important to the really growth of Marvel. From 1961 to 1965, Stan Lee and his great editors actually created all those A-list characters we know today. That includes Fantastic Four, Spider-Man, Hulk, X-Men, and I think also Iron Man. All were introduced during that period of time. Later on, there were many other characters introduced. In the 70s, for example, some were very successful. One always remembers Howard the Duck in particular. Not only was comic not really very good, but there was also a movie made that is arguably one of the worst movies ever made in the history of Hollywood. I think the key to thinking back, though, about Marvel's history is think of a business that had no physical assets. Its assets were the characters or intangible intellectual property. So what they were dealing with was what you don't normally think of in a major media institution. Marvel certainly had its share of commercial success. There's no question about it, and was well known. Some of the characters made it to television and are also well known. One particularly remembers the Hulk as having a very successful television show early on. And most of Marvel's revenues during that time came from certain media forms and from consumer products that were licensed from the company to other companies or individuals to make products which featured the characters from Marvel. A quick pause now, and I'll pick things up when we return.
The Who's down in Who Newville were making their list, but some didn't know Walmart has the best brands for their gifts.
What about toys? Do they have brands kids have been wanting all year?
Yep, Barbie, Tony's, and Lego. Gifts that will make them all cheer.
Do you mean they have all the brands I adore?
They have Nintendo, Nespresso, Apple, and more.
What about...
So the Who answered questions from friends till they were blue. Each one listened and shouted, from Walmart? Who knew? Shop gifts from top brands for everyone on your list in the Walmart app.
So now we come to the 1990s, and a couple of things happened that really hit Marvel very hard. The first is that in the 80s and the early 90s, there had been a comic book collectibility craze. And people were buying comic books to save and put away, feeling that they would be worth a substantial amount of money in the future. And the consumers eventually figured out that no, most of these comic books would never be worth anything, only certain ones. And the sales of comic books dropped dramatically. And the peak of that collectibility craze was actually in 1992. And then sales started dropping fairly precipitously. Marvel had also done a number of acquisitions at very high prices of other collectability types of products, particularly trading cards. And those businesses turned out not to be very successful, as Marvel had probably overpaid for them. In addition to those problems, Marvel had financed these acquisitions, and the company as a whole was something that's called high-yield debt. And this simply means debt where the interest rates are quite high. This requires the company to produce a lot of cash to pay the interest every year on the high-yield debt. And as the business went south, if you will, very, very steadily, Marvel could no longer pay the interest on its debt. And of course, when that's the case, organizations, companies can't pay their debts. The way to fix that or to cure it is a process called bankruptcy. And Marvel went into bankruptcy in 1996 and came out of bankruptcy in late 1998. And during bankruptcy, there are a number of names associated with the battle to bring Marvel out of bankruptcy. The company prior to bankruptcy was controlled by Ronald Perelman, but in bankruptcy, it was controlled by Icahn, and then was brought out of bankruptcy by Isaac Perlmutter. All, if you will, in bankruptcy, battling for the rights to actually bring the company out of bankruptcy. And interestingly, Marvel was a public company on the New York Stock Exchange and went through the bankruptcy as a public company. So as that process was going, you could still look up every day and see what Marvel's stock price was doing, despite the fact that times were very dismal. Finally, in late 1998, Ike Perlmutter was able to control the company, bring it out of bankruptcy. And I was asked to come to the company as CEO in 1999. I had known Ike Perlmutter from a previous turnaround I had done called Remington Products, which is not the gun business, but is the men's grooming business, Remington shavers, and so on. And we had a very successful time with that turnaround. Isaac Perlmutter owned about 50% of that company of Remington at that time. So it was very lucrative financially for him. And so I guess he had a pretty good feeling about me and what I could do. And that's how I ended up coming to Marvel. There's a very, very good, very detailed book that you might want to look at called Comic Book Wars. It's written by Dan Raviv, who was actually with CBS News. You may remember him from various reporting roles on CBS News. It's got a great deal of detail on the bankruptcy and what went on during that 2-year period. But for those of you that would be interested in learning more about bankruptcy, what happened with Marvel, I highly recommend that book, Comic Book Wars, Dan Raviv. Well, thank you very much for listening. That's it for this week. Next week, we're going to start talking about the key decisions that were made, the key strategic decisions from Marvel that really turned around the company. And there are quite a number of them, so it will take a couple of weeks to cover them all. But I think it'll be very, very interesting to all of you to see just exactly what the thinking was, my thinking, the board's thinking, other senior people in Marvel's thinking about how we should proceed and actually what we came up with and actually did. So thank you all for coming today. I really appreciate it. I'm Peter Cuneo.